In November of 1943, a Luftwaffe Reichsmarschall named Hermann Göring stood at his window in Berlin and watched American P-51 Mustangs escort a daylight bombing formation directly over the German capital. According to multiple accounts, he turned away from the window quietly and said, "The war is lost." The Mustangs above Berlin should not have been there. They were not supposed to have the range. They were not supposed to have the high altitude performance. They were not supposed to be capable of escorting a B-17 from East Anglia to Berlin and back. They were capable of all of those things because 11 months earlier, the British had taken an underperforming American fighter airframe and installed inside it a 27-liter liquid-cooled British V12 engine. This is the story of that engine. It is the engine that won the war. Vanework. To understand the Rolls-Royce Merlin, you have to begin with two figures that almost no one outside aviation history now remembers. The first was a woman named Lady Lucy Houston. She was a former London showgirl who had been married 3 times. Each time to a man wealthier than the last, and by the early 1930s, she was one of the richest individuals in Britain. In 1931, the British Labour government announced that it would not finance the British team's entry into the Schneider Trophy, a prestigious international seaplane racing competition. Lady Houston wrote a personal check to cover the cost herself. The amount was £100,000, the equivalent of approximately £8 million today. The British team competed. The aircraft they flew was a Supermarine S-6B. The engine inside it was a Rolls-Royce R, a 36-liter V12 that ultimately produced 2,350 horsepower. The British won the trophy. They also gained something more important. The R engine became the technical foundation for the engine that would follow it. The second figure was Sir Henry Royce. By 1932, he was in his late 60s, suffering from declining health and working largely from his country home at West Wittering on the English south coast. He had built Rolls-Royce from the ground up. He had survived the First World War by selling aero engines to the British military, including the Eagle, the Falcon, and the Hawk, engines that had powered the Bristol F-2 fighter and the Handley Page 0/100 bomber. Now, in his final years, he turned his attention to one last engine. He believed that the future of aerial combat would require something between the 700 horsepower Peregrine and the 2,000 horsepower Vulture. He believed the gap could be filled by a new 12-cylinder design that he called internally the PV-12. The letters stood for private venture. Rolls-Royce was funding it entirely from company resources without a government contract. The first PV-12 was bench tested at the Rolls-Royce Works in Derby on October 15, 1933. It produced 790 horsepower. By the time it passed its type certification in July of 1934, Henry Royce had been dead for 16 months. He died in April 1933, 6 months before his own engine ran for the first time. He never saw it fly. The engine, following the Rolls-Royce convention of naming aero engines after birds of prey, was renamed Merlin, after a small species of European falcon. It made its first flight in February of 1935, mounted in a Hawker Hart biplane. By 1936, the Air Ministry had selected 2 new fighter aircraft for British service, the Hawker Hurricane and the Supermarine Spitfire. Both were designed around the Merlin. By the summer of 1940, the Merlin Mark III was the standard production engine inside both the Hurricane and the Spitfire. It produced approximately 1,030 horsepower at 3,000 revolutions per minute, with a swept volume of 27 liters across 12 cylinders in a 60-degree V configuration. The Daimler-Benz DB601 powering the German Messerschmitt 109 had a slightly larger displacement, 34 liters, but produced almost identical power. The The two engines were closely matched. What was not closely matched was the production capacity behind them. Britain was alone. France had fallen in June. The United States was still officially neutral. Everything the Royal Air Force flew, the Merlin had to power. On May 14, 1940, 4 days after Churchill became Prime Minister, a Canadian newspaper baron named Lord Beaverbrook was appointed Minister of Aircraft Production. Beaverbrook understood one thing immediately. The Battle of Britain would be won or lost on the number of Merlin engines that could be produced. He ordered a complete prioritization of fighter production. Civilian programs were scrapped. Bomber programs were deferred. Every ton of aluminum, every machine tool, every skilled worker went into Hurricane and Spitfire production, and therefore into Merlin production. In May of 1940, Britain built fewer than 300 fighters. By July of that year, that figure had nearly doubled. To support this scale of production, Britain built what came to be called the shadow factories. The Merlin was being built in Derby, but if the Luftwaffe destroyed Derby, the engine supply would collapse. A second shadow factory was therefore built at Crewe. A third was constructed at Hillington near Glasgow, opened in 1940, eventually employing 25,000 workers and producing 400 Merlins a week by 1943. A fourth shadow factory was operated by Ford of Britain at Trafford Park near Manchester. By the end of the war, Ford alone had produced more than 30,000 Merlin engines. The factories ran 24 hours a day. The Merlin was no longer just an engine. It was an industrial infrastructure spanning 4 sites across Britain. During the Battle of Britain itself, between July and October of 1940, the Merlin had one significant weakness, and the Germans knew it. The engine used a float-controlled carburetor, while the Daimler-Benz used direct fuel injection. When a Spitfire or Hurricane pilot pitched the nose down into a steep dive, negative G-forces caused the fuel in the carburetor to lift away from the float chamber, producing a momentary cut in fuel supply. The engine would briefly cough and lose power. A German pilot being chased by a Spitfire could simply roll into a sharp dive, and the Spitfire would fall behind for 2 or 3 seconds while the Merlin recovered. The British solution, devised by a Royal Aircraft Establishment engineer named Beatrice Schilling, was a small brass washer with a precisely calibrated hole drilled through it. Installed in the carburetor, it restricted the fuel flow just enough to prevent the negative G fuel cut. RAF pilots called it Miss Schilling's orifice. It saved Spitfires. Eventually, the float carburetor was replaced entirely. But for a critical 6 months in 1940, a small brass washer designed by a woman engineer was the difference between life and death over the English Channel. As the war progressed, the Merlin was developed and redeveloped in a way that no other piston-aero engine in history has been. Approximately 50 distinct variants were produced. The first major improvement was the introduction of 100-octane aviation fuel, supplied from the United States. With higher octane fuel, the supercharger could run at higher boost pressures, and power increased to over 1,300 horsepower in the Merlin 20. The next major leap came from a Rolls-Royce engineer named Sir Stanley Hooker, who developed a 2-stage, 2-speed supercharger. This single innovation transformed the Merlin from a single-altitude engine into an engine that could maintain its power at any altitude up to 40,000 feet. The Merlin 61, introduced in 1942, used Hooker's supercharger. It changed what the war could look like. Because the Merlin 61 is where the engine becomes the story of the P-51 Mustang. In the summer of 1942, a Rolls-Royce test pilot named Ronald Harker was offered the chance to fly a Mustang Mark I, the original Allison-powered version that had been built by North American Aviation in response to a British purchasing request. Harker flew the aircraft and immediately recognized that the airframe was exceptional. The aerodynamics were beautiful. The laminar flow wing was years ahead of anything else flying. But the Allison V1710 engine inside it had a single-stage supercharger that ran out of breath above 15,000 feet. Above that altitude, the Mustang became sluggish. Harker had an idea. He proposed that a Merlin 65, a derivative of the 61, be installed in the Mustang. The first Merlin-powered Mustang prototype flew on October 13, 1942, with Captain R.T. Shepard, the Rolls-Royce chief test pilot, at the controls. The performance was, to use the official term, spectacular. Top speed jumped from approximately 390 miles per hour to 440. Service ceiling rose by 10,000 feet. The aircraft, redesignated XP-51B, entered American production in June 1943. But the Merlins it required could not come from Britain. Every Merlin Rolls-Royce produced was already committed to Spitfires, Lancasters, and Mosquitoes. So the engines came instead from Detroit. In September 1940, Henry Ford had personally refused to build the Merlin in the United States. The Packard Motor Car Company accepted the contract instead. The deal was worth $130 million in 1940 prices, the equivalent of nearly $3 billion today. The first Packard-built Merlin ran on August 2, 1941. By the end of the war, Packard had produced 55,500 Merlin engines in Detroit alone. When Rolls-Royce engineers in Britain stripped down one of the early Packard-built engines to inspect its tolerances, they were astonished. The American engine, mass-produced on assembly lines by a largely female workforce, had tighter manufacturing tolerances than the hand-finished British Merlins built in Derby. The Packard Merlin was, by some measures, a better engine than the British original. By 1944, Packard Merlins were powering P-51 Mustangs from American factories at North American Aviation. The Mustangs were escorting B-17s and B-24s from England all the way to Berlin and back, a feat the Spitfire, with its smaller fuel capacity, was never able to match. And it was this, the Merlin and the Mustang, flying over Berlin, that produced Goering's quiet sentence at the window. The Mustang had not won the war by itself, but the Mustang made possible the daylight bombing campaign that destroyed German industrial capacity. And the Mustang was made possible by the Merlin. By the time production ceased in 1950, approximately 168,000 Merlin engines had been built. 55,500 came from Packard in Detroit. The rest came from Derby, Crewe, Glasgow, and the Ford Works at Trafford Park. The engine had powered the Hurricane and the Spitfire that won the Battle of Britain in 1940. It had powered the Lancaster bomber that conducted the strategic bombing of Germany, the largest single production application of the engine, with more Merlins installed in Lancasters than in any other aircraft type. It had powered the de Havilland Mosquito, the fastest wooden aircraft of the war. It had powered the Beaufighter, the Wellington, and the Halifax. And it had powered, through Packard, the P-51 Mustang that escorted Allied bombers from England to Berlin. The Merlin was not the most powerful engine of the war. The Daimler-Benz had more displacement. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp had nearly double the cubic inches. The Junkers Jumo 213 had fuel injection. The Merlin had something none of them had. It had refinement. It had a development trajectory that took it from 1,000 horsepower in 1936 to over 2,000 horsepower in its final variants, a doubling of power over 12 years from the same fundamental architecture. Most other engines of the era saw improvements of perhaps 30 or 40%. The Merlin saw improvements of more than 100%. It did this through carburetor refinement, supercharger development, fuel octane upgrades, materials science improvements, and a culture at Rolls-Royce that treated every engine returning from service as evidence to be studied. And it did this at scale. 168,000 engines is a number that is difficult to grasp. It means that in any given month during the peak production years, somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 Merlins were being completed across the 4 primary factories. It means that during the Battle of Britain, when a Spitfire pilot took off from Biggin Hill, the engine in front of him was, statistically, one of the most produced precision instruments in the history of British manufacturing. The Merlin was not just an engine, it was a national infrastructure. It was the physical proof that British engineering, when given total wartime priority, could produce something at industrial scale that the rest of the world could not match. Henry Royce never saw any of this. He died in April 1933. 6 months before his own engine first ran. Lady Houston, who had financed the R engine that became the technical foundation for the Merlin, died in December 1936, 3 years before the Battle of Britain. Lord Beaverbrook lived to see the war's end and was widely credited with the production miracle that kept the Hurricanes and Spitfires in the air during 1940. Sir Stanley Hooker, the engineer behind the 2-stage supercharger, went on to design the jet engines that powered post-war commercial aviation. Ronald Harker, the test pilot who proposed putting a Merlin in the Mustang, was knighted. The engine itself was largely superseded by jet propulsion after 1950. But the Merlins that remained continued flying. Battle of Britain Memorial Flight aircraft, Hurricane, Spitfire, and Lancaster, still operate with Merlin engines in 2026, more than 80 years after their original construction. The Merlin was not the most powerful engine of its era. The Daimler-Benz had more displacement. The Allison had less weight. The Junkers Jumo had fuel injection. The Merlin had something none of them had. A story that began with a showgirl and a dying engineer, and ended with 168,000 units of refined British metal in the sky above every front of the war. Refinement multiplied by scale is what changes history, and it took a small 27-liter V12 to prove it.